Hello, wonderful United States history students. This is my recorded slideshow lecture on the Reconstruction Era. I'm Mr. Endres. Let's begin. The significance of the Reconstruction Era cannot be understated because it follows the United States Civil War. The Reconstruction Era is essentially the second birth of the United States of America. Our first birth being the American Revolution, where we gained our independence from Britain. We established as the foundation for our country the Declaration of Independence, which is essentially a statement of principles, and the Constitution, which set up our government, the Bill of Rights, which established our individual rights. But we never fully addressed the issue of slavery and how slavery and being a slave-owning country is inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States of America. Our country was founded upon slavery and therefore racism. And the problems associated with the institution of slavery come to a head in the United States Civil War. And it was during the Civil War that President Abraham Lincoln provided two documents that gave meaning to why the Civil War was being fought and a goal to accomplish when it was over. The Emancipation Proclamation, which is a written statement, stated that all slaves in the Confederacy, in the states of rebellion, were to be freed. Now, this was essentially meaningless when it was issued at the time in the late summer of 1862 to be put into effect in January of 1863 because the Confederacy didn't give a hoot what Abraham Lincoln said. But it was important for several reasons. One was an international reason. We didn't want any non-slave owning countries like Great Britain lending support to the Confederacy, but that's not what concerns us here. What concerns us here for this lecture is the fact that Abraham Lincoln is making this war about slavery. The issue that people were not talking about, or at least not talking about as much as they could have, was this war being about slavery. Abraham Lincoln makes this war about emancipating the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862. The second document was a speech that he gave a few months after the most important battle, arguably the most important battle of the whole war, the Battle of Gettysburg. He, in November of 1863, gave the Gettysburg Address. Arguably, I don't even think it's arguable, it is one of the greatest speeches in American history in which Abraham Lincoln defines for us what our principles are as Americans. It's really just as important as the Declaration of Independence. And at the very end of this relatively short speech, Abraham Lincoln explains how this war is to provide a new birth of freedom. So with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, we are creating in our country a new birth of freedom. And it's very clear what this freedom is to be. There is to be no more slavery. Slavery is to be eradicated, and all people in the United States are to be equal. And that is what makes the Civil War and the Reconstruction Era the second birth of the United States of America. When we were founded as a slave-owning country. And even though the Declaration of Independence makes very clear in its opening lines, it provides us with an assertion of equality, there really is no statement of equality in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. So freedom and equality, which are the foundation for every single rights movement in American history, will come about during the Reconstruction Era. Now, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, but there were members of Congress that wanted to champion this cause of a new birth of freedom, and immediately after the end of the Civil War began passing important amendments to the United States Constitution to make these dreams of a new birth of freedom and equality a reality. The first was the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified at the end of 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution ends slavery. So this despicable, inhumane, racist institution, which had existed for nearly 2.5 centuries in North America, is now officially eradicated. It is gone. Now, I don't have the 13th Amendment written up here on this particular slide. However, if you get a chance to ever read it, it's interesting because there is a particular clause in the 13th Amendment that says, essentially, and I'm going to say this in my own words, slavery is abolished except in cases of punishment for a crime. Except in cases of punishment for a crime. And just to be a little contemporary here, this idea has become the subject of a Netflix documentary, if you're interested, that's simply called 13. And of course, the 13 stands for the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And in this particular Netflix documentary, it traces how African Americans have been disproportionately targeted as criminals and locked up from 1865 through the early 21st century through today. The thesis of this film being that slavery has never gone away. Because there was this particular clause in the 13th Amendment, a significantly disproportionate number of African Americans have been imprisoned. Okay, so there's that if you're interested. The next amendment that was ratified in the wake of the Civil War is the 14th Amendment. Guys, you cannot underestimate the significance of the 14th Amendment. It is the foundation for individual rights and civil rights. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought that the Bill of Rights was the foundation for individual rights. Well, yes, you would be right. The 14th Amendment solidifies those individual rights. If you remember in my description of the Second Amendment, the right to gun ownership, well, the Second Amendment begins with the statement that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the protection of the state, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, the 14th Amendment says, well, you are, as an individual, are equal to that state militia or that well-regulated militia. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here. Let me explain the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment does a couple of things that I would like to focus on. The first is it defines citizenship. It defines citizenship. Citizens are individuals who are born in the United States of America. That is written clearly in the 14th Amendment. Now, I'll go on to explain that here in a second. So, people who are born in the United States of America are American citizens, simply by being born here. The other thing that I want to focus on in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that all citizens shall receive equal protection under the law. Everybody is equal. Those are the two important aspects that I would like for you to know for the 14th Amendment. So let me talk about those one by one. So anybody born in the United States of America is an American citizen. The reason why Congress had that element in the 14th Amendment, and by the way, the man who wrote the 14th Amendment was a man by the name of John Bingham, in case you're interested. The reason why Congress put that in the 14th Amendment is because they wanted to make sure that all freed slaves would, under federal law, be American citizens. That the freed slaves, based upon being born into slavery, they might somehow get robbed of their citizenship. They want to make very clear that everybody born in the USA, slave or non-slave, was now an American citizen. So that's why that's in the 14th Amendment. Now, this particular clause in the 14th Amendment has created controversy in more recent years because of immigration. So if an immigrant comes into the United States of America and gives birth to a child, that child is automatically an American citizen. And that's led to more recent controversies that I am not going to get into here because I'm talking about the Reconstruction Era. But there's that aspect. So hopefully you understand that citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment. Okay, and then equal protection under the law. Every American citizen is equal. There is no statement about black or white, male or female. It just says American citizens, equal protection under the law. That is what makes the 14th Amendment one of the most important amendments in all of American history. It is the foundation for all civil rights cases. So if you look at a more recent 2015 Supreme Court decision that said that that you are allowed to marry anybody, a man can marry a man, a woman can marry a woman, that the Supreme Court made their decision based upon the 14th Amendment. Any type of civil rights legislation that focuses on equality is based upon the 14th Amendment. All right, so there we go. With the 13th Amendment, we free the slaves. With the 14th Amendment, we make everybody equal under the law. And then the 15th Amendment says that you are not allowed to stop anybody from voting based upon their race. Okay, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, but hopefully it makes sense. The 15th Amendment says you are not allowed to stop anybody from voting based upon their race. So what this does in effect is it allows all African Americans the right to vote, or at least at this point in time in history, all African American men the right to vote. Now, the 14th Amendment should have made it for, women too, but it's going to take a while for the Supreme Court and really society as a whole to look at the 14th Amendment and apply equality to women citizens as well. But that's for a later unit. All right, so think of what this has done. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. We've ended slavery, we've provided the right to vote, and we've created equality. This is something that we were never able to do back in the Constitutional Convention. So let me read what I've written on this slide here. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution should have created equality between blacks and whites throughout the United States of America, and it should have done all this by the year 1870. So, as I record this slideshow lecture in the summer of 2020, the situation between blacks and whites today remains tense. There is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is heating up even as I record this lecture. Why is it that these 3 amendments, federal laws that apply to everybody in the United States of America, which should have immediately created equality, why are there still problems today? What happened back then? Why is there still inequality, protest, demonstrations, death, violence? Why is this still going on today? And students, that is the story of the Reconstruction Era. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were rendered impotent by the year 1877. So if there's anything that you need to remember from this entire lecture, it's this that I wrote on this screen right here. This is the best way to understand the Reconstruction Era. The North may have won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction. I would encourage you not to think that the Civil War just ended with the firing of bullets in April of 1865. Really, the end of the war was the beginning of the creation of the new USA and the opportunity to fulfill Abraham Lincoln's vision of what he called a new birth of freedom. And by 1877, it failed. The old Confederates, the old slaveholders, they won the Reconstruction Era. Congress would not pass additional legislation to support the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution until the year 1964 and 1965. That's 100 years after the end of the Civil War. That's a little over 50 years ago. That's fairly recent in our country's history. And that helps us to understand why, even though slavery ended so very long ago, it's really only been within the last 2 generations that we've been doing the hard work of correcting centuries, literally centuries of injustice to create a more free and equal society for blacks and whites and for all citizens in the United States of America. And that is, in short, the story of Reconstruction. But of course, it's much more complicated than all that. Let's learn the story. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln was was elected to a second term as President of the United States of America. He would not serve his term for very long because sadly he was assassinated. And that was the first presidential assassination in American history. But after he was elected and he was inaugurated in March of 1865, he gave an amazing speech. And the speech he delivered, which came at the end of the Civil War would end the following month, he attempted to address the massive loss of life, the incredible enormity of human suffering that had transpired over the course of the last 4 years during the American Civil War. So if you look up deaths during the American Civil War, how many people died during the American Civil War, you'll find that that death number tends to hover traditionally around the number 420,000 deaths. However, immediately after the war, there were people who died from war injuries, and then also there were a lot of suicides. And that number, the number of people who died after the war, then it goes up to well over 500,000 deaths, some as high as 750,000 deaths, 750,000 people. This was an enormous number. If the same number of people percentage-wise died in the United States of America, that would be the equivalent of 30 million Americans dying. It's a horrendous number that we can't even fathom today, and I hope never during our lifetime do we have to deal with something as horrible as the American Civil War was in the middle of the 19th century. And in Lincoln's second inaugural address, he tries to give meaning to the suffering. And here's what he says, and allow me to quote Abraham Lincoln here. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Okay, what is Lincoln saying here? He's saying that if God wills that this war continue, it should continue until, and I quote here, until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. Here's what this means. First of all, this is a very religious statement. Abraham Lincoln is drawing God into it. And essentially what he's saying is, God is angry at the United States of America for the sin of slavery. He goes on to say, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, as in the whips that whipped the slave, shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, in other words, everybody who dies in the Civil War, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said today. In other words, he's quoting the Bible. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. He's telling Americans, this is why we're all dying. We are dying for the sin of slavery. What's implied is that this sin must go away. We must be a country of free and equal people. Okay. So let's learn the more specific stories during the Reconstruction era of how individuals were freed and then how they found themselves back in a state of slavery in everything but name by the year 1877. During Abraham Lincoln's last year in office, he helped establish a federal organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, a freedman is an individual who was born into slavery and then freed. So you're talking about freed slaves when you see the word freedman there. But freed man, it could be a man, woman, child, anybody born in slavery and now freed. And so what was the Freedmen's Bureau? The best way to think of the Freedmen's Bureau is to think of them as a bunch of schools that were built in the South. The idea behind it being that freed slaves in order to be successful as a freedman in society, must be able to do basic mathematics and to be able to read and to write so that they could run a grocery store, for example. Or if they're going to get hired to work on a farm, they can read the contract by which they are being hired, in which they sign their name to. Education is power. So Abraham Lincoln and the Congress of the United States of America established the Freedmen's Bureau. They were going to build these, and think of them as schoolhouses throughout the South. Northern educators were going to go into the South, and they were going to begin the process of educating and helping the freed slaves. So you start with basic education. You would literally have mostly white, well-educated, and as you see, very bold and daring people from the North go to the South, to live in the South, to educate the freed slaves. Teach them arithmetic, reading, writing, so that they would have a better chance of survival as a freed person. And so you can imagine these schoolhouses would be quite amazing. As an educator, I could only imagine what it was like for teachers and the Freedmen's Bureau, because you would have little kids like kindergarten age, 4, 5, 6 years old, and they'd be learning their numbers and their letters and learning how to read and write, just like we did at about the same age in our life. But you'd also have an 80-year-old who never learned how to read or write or do basic mathematics, sitting right next to a 5-year-old. These schools were packed, because everybody had this really strong sense that this knowledge is our power and is foundational to our freedom in the post-Civil War world. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau also did other things. They provided health care. They did provide some sort of assistance to help people starting a business. So it was more than just a schoolhouse, but I think the schoolhouse imagery is the best way to start as you think about the Freedmen's Bureau. So, okay, what a wonderful thing. We're going to have these Freedmen's Bureau buildings established all throughout the South. The former slaves are going to be well educated so they can go on and live a more free life. Okay, here's a specific example of an individual who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau. His name was Marshall Twitchell. And by the way, Marshall Twitchell was one of the central subjects in the PBS documentary Reconstruction, America's Second Civil War. And they go into his story in quite some depth. That is how I learned about Marshall Twitchell. Marshall Twitchell sounded like a very bold and daring man. He had fought in the Civil War. He was a soldier in the Civil War. I forget exactly how high of a rank he achieved, but it sounds like he was a respected officer. He had been wounded in battle. He had been shot through the cheek, which this black and white photo sort of hints at. And after the Civil War was over, he felt very strongly about making sure that the lives of those 500,000 men who died during the Civil War did not die in vain. He wanted to be a part of the Reconstruction effort. So here's this particular individual who goes to the Freedmen's Bureau and says, I would like to work for the Freedmen's Bureau, and I would like for you to put me in the most racist area in the South. So this is what makes Marshall Twitchell an extraordinarily bold, and a lot of people argue heroic individual. Because as you can imagine, the old Confederates, they don't want anything to do with the Freedmen's Bureau. They're humiliated by the fact that they lost this war. Now they're going to lose all their slaves. And now here comes the federal government that they had been fighting against during the Civil War to build these schoolhouses to educate and empower blacks, their freed slaves. They're going to want to destroy these Freedmen's Bureau schools. So here comes Marshall Twitchell, former officer, says, put me in the most dangerous area and I'll run the Freedmen's Bureau in that most dangerous area. And the area where he was placed was in northwestern Louisiana, along the Red River. So here he comes, this proud soldier, this proud tough guy, an idealist. We're going to educate the freed slaves. We're going to empower them to help run society here in Louisiana. Marshall Twitchell. Okay, so I have a particular term that's associated with the Reconstruction era that you need to know, and that term is carpetbagger. Carpetbagger was a term, it's a derogatory term used by Southerners to describe the Northerners that came down to reconstruct the South during the Reconstruction era. For the most part, it was used to describe not necessarily former soldiers like Marshal Twitchell, but rather individuals from the North who came to the South seeking economic opportunity. Because there had been so much destruction during the Civil War, there was money to be made in the reconstruction of the South during the Civil War and establishing factories, hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, whatever. And there were some Northerners that came to the South, especially since there was significant loss of life among men in the South. They could begin the process of building up the industry in the South. And of course, the Confederate men who survived this war were disgusted by these Yankees coming down south to rebuild their community. So it was dangerous to be a carpetbagger, which is why this imagery of somebody just coming down for exploitative economic reasons is a little is inaccurate. To be a Northerner and to travel south to live down south after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era was very dangerous. You tended to have to be very bold or sometimes desperate for a job. But in most cases, they were idealists, like Marshal Twitchell, that they wanted to rebuild the South. They wanted to reconstruct the South to fulfill the goals of creating a new birth of freedom for the country, to make the country more free, more equal. All right, so there's that term, carpetbaggers. When Marshal Twitchell, hey, this is a nice little love story. When Marshal Twitchell moved to northwestern Louisiana, there was the beautiful daughter of a local former plantation owner and her name was Adele Coleman. And here is this beautiful young Southern lady who sees this sharp-looking, uniformed Union soldier, Marshal Twitchell, come in, and he's sort of macho and he takes over and he's part of this righteous cause to reconstruct the South. And she was a bit taken by him, and the two of them fell in love, and the two of them got married. Adele Coleman married Marshal Twitchell. So think about this. How do you think some of those old Confederate men who were disgusted that they lost the war, how would they feel about this Southern belle falling in love with and marrying this Union soldier who was there in Louisiana, part of the Reconstruction effort? Well, they probably were kind of mad about that situation. So now's when I introduce you to a second term, Scalawag. The definition of a scalawag is a white Southerner who supported the Reconstruction efforts of the North after the Civil War. Now, if I could be honest here, Adele Coleman is probably not the best example of a scalawag, because a scalawag was usually referred to describe a man, and in most cases it was a poor white man, not a former wealthy plantation owner, but a poor white man who wanted to see the plantation system of the South and the old economic system destroyed and rebuilt. So they welcomed the Union soldiers coming into the South to reconstruct the South. But Adele Coleman is a Southerner who fell in love with a Northerner and was, supportive of what he was doing in the reconstruction of the South. So we can sort of call Adele Coleman a scalawag as well. So scalawag and carpetbagger are two terms that you need to know, which came along during the Reconstruction era. All right, so how'd things go for Adele Coleman and Marshal Twitchell? Let me just flip it back to this slide right here so we can see both of them. Well, Marshal Twitchell did his job very, very well. He oversaw the construction of Freedmen Bureau schools and their administration. Freed slaves were educated. Freed slaves began earning their own money. Society in this most racist part of the South, at least as identified by Congress at the time, seemed to be changing under the brave leadership of Marshal Twitchell. But then an organization called the Ku Klux Klan, which developed during the Reconstruction era, which we'll learn more about later, they ambushed Marshal Twitchell. They caught him in a boat by himself near his home. They began firing at him. they shot both of Marshal Twitchell's arms off. Marshal Twitchell, this brave young man, this anti-racist, had gone from the north to the south, one of the worst parts of the South, to provide a new life for African Americans. He ended up going home without his arms, spending the rest of his life in pain, and obviously having to be nursed and tended to for the remainder of his days. The sad story of Marshal Twitchell is allegorical to the story of the Reconstruction era as a whole. Let's learn more about it now. This individual is considered to be one of the greatest generals of the American Civil War era. He is also from Central Ohio, specifically Lancaster, Ohio. When he was born, his dad named him after the famous Ohio Native American warrior Tecumseh. He was named Tecumseh Sherman. But when he was a boy taken to his church to be baptized, the minister of his church said, "I am not going to baptize a boy with a Native American first name." Specifically, this minister said a heathen first name. So the dad said, "All right, we'll make Tecumseh his middle name." And he ended up being called William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman would grow up becoming one of the greatest generals in American history. Hey, and for what it's worth, you might find it interesting, growing up in Lancaster, William Tecumseh Sherman said when he finally was old enough to leave Central Ohio, he said that he never wanted to return to Central Ohio. He was very happy to get out of here. And his home in not too far away, Lancaster, is now a museum. You can go visit it. It's fun. All right, William Tecumseh Sherman. He was most likely bipolar. He had significant mood swings and suffered from significant depression, which is why he, at the beginning of the American Civil War, he wasn't really identified as one of the great generals. He wasn't predicted to be a great general. The Civil War was absolutely amazing in terms of what it did to the United States Army, because the first generals that we had at the beginning of the Civil War proved to be not the best. They had their jobs because of their political connections. And people who got these jobs, these high-ranking military positions, because of their political connections, because of who they knew, because they were born into a good family or whatnot, well, they ended up not being great generals, and Abraham Lincoln ended up hating them. And they weren't winning. And so they lost their jobs, and when you get to the end of the Civil War, the North ends up producing these great generals, guys like Ulysses S. Grant, who is also from Ohio, and William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, when you think of William Tecumseh Sherman, I want you to think of a gruff, tough man. It is also fair to think of William Tecumseh Sherman as being an individual who does not support equal rights. This is a man who, after the Civil War, will fight Native Americans. He does not respect traditional Native American culture. And then you can also think the same way about his attitude towards African Americans. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that he doesn't necessarily believe in the equal rights of African Americans, because his story is complicated in terms of what he does at the end of the Civil War, because you might be tempted to think that he is the most progressive, egalitarian person at the whole end of the Civil War based upon what he does. Okay, so let's learn his story. William Tecumseh Sherman at the end of the Civil War is probably most famous for capturing and completely laying waste to the city of Atlanta. Sherman took his soldiers, his regiment of soldiers, most of which were from Ohio. He surrounded and laid siege to Atlanta. Atlanta finally fell. William Tecumseh Sherman, who was famous for saying war is all hell, and he believed in total war, went into Atlanta and just burned everything. Now, he didn't go in there with the intent of killing and burning civilians, but he would go and burn a grocery store, burn a bank, burn everything. His purpose there was total war. He wanted to destroy the infrastructure of the South. After he burned Atlanta, they made their march to the sea, and along the way, he would find plantations and he would destroy them. His men would find railroad lines, and they would lay dynamite sticks under the railroad tracks. They'd blow them up. They created what they called Sherman's bows, because when the railroad tracks blew up, they kind of curled in a particular way. But that would obviously stop the trains from running. If you were a plantation owner and you knew that Sherman was coming, first of all, that meant you were probably a woman, since your man was off fighting. And so the women would be standing guard at their home, and they would find out that here comes Sherman's army. They're coming, and they're going to they're going to loot your house. these women would usually take their precious, whatever precious things they didn't want the Union Army to get, and they would bury them somewhere in their yard. And Sherman's men had this way of figuring out where they buried it by going up to the women and forcing them to sit down on their front porch. And they would have the men just start to go around the yard and start digging in particular places while one guy looked into the eyes of the woman, waiting for her to turn her head in angst and consternation if the Union soldiers were starting to dig someplace close to where she buried her goods. And once this guy started seeing the woman sitting on the porch start to sweat a little bit, he would turn around and point to his men, "Go dig over there, that's where the stuff is." And they would steal and loot the stuff from these Confederate homes. They did this from Atlanta, then to Savannah, Georgia, then they went north to Columbia, South Carolina, and there was a woman in Columbia, South Carolina who just went running up to an Ohio soldier, just beating on him, saying, "God damn you, God damn you, God damn you." And this Ohio soldier, this low-ranking soldier, just pushed her away and said, "I do feel sorry for all the women and children, but South Carolina must be destroyed." This was 1865. This is the end of the war. William Tecumseh Sherman was hated throughout the South, waging this total war, this economic destruction of the South, destroying homes, destroying property, especially the property of the wealthy. So the Confederates hated Sherman, but think if you were a slave in the South. Think if you were a slave in the South working on a plantation. You found out Sherman's army was coming. Well, a lot of times, you wouldn't even wait for the army to show up. You'd toss down that plow and you just start running to Sherman's army. Here comes your liberator. William Tecumseh Sherman is a man, if you are a slave, to fall down on his feet and kiss him, because when he shows up, your owner, your master's plantation is going to get destroyed. It's going to get looted. You could cheer, you could embrace those soldiers, and a lot of the soldiers were embraced by the freed slaves. But then what do you do as a freed slave? Well, you're certainly not staying on that plantation. You're jumping in line behind the marching Union army that's following William Tecumseh Sherman. You are now going to be part of this army. So William Tecumseh Sherman has a problem. His problem is all of these freed slaves. They're all tagging along. He now has to find the resources to feed them, to take care of them, and he doesn't. So imagine you're William Tecumseh Sherman at this point in time in history. It's 1865. It's near the end of the war. You've ransacked all of these plantations. You have essentially made most all of Georgia yours. And you've got all these African Americans that are tagging along behind you. How do you deal with them? You can't feed them all. So imagine what you would do. What could you do to essentially get rid of these tag-along slaves? Make it so that they're not your responsibility anymore. What would you do? Knowing that essentially your army is now in control of most of Georgia, and that you've ransacked all of these plantation homes. Well, here's what Sherman decided to do. He issues a very important proclamation. As a general, he can issue field orders. These are essentially commands that a general can order in a time of combat that people must follow. And what he issues in 1865 is something called Special Field Order Number 15. Here's what Special Field Order Number 15 did. Of the land that he has conquered in Georgia, he parcels it out, and he says that every freed slave family, every husband and wife and children, every family gets 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule. That's your land to farm. You're free. This is your property. Do with it as you will. Now, to give you a sense of this, I assume you know what a mule is. This gives us a sense that Sherman had a whole lot of extra mules that were probably used to schlep cannon and such. He probably could afford to get rid of them at the end of the war, so a freed African-American family would get a mule, and they got 40 acres. An acre is a football field, so think of 40 football fields. That's what you get, and you get it for free. Now, the former Confederate plantation owners were like, but that's our property, that's our land. Sherman's like, no, it's not. We're the Union. We just conquered you. This now belongs to the freed slaves. So what you're seeing here is a complete revolution of society. African Americans, blacks who were, months before enslaved, now have a pretty substantial plot of land that they can now farm and begin claiming as their own. And he does this throughout the South. Special Field Order number 15, which granted every freed African American family 40 acres and a mule, is one of the most progressive, I can't really call them a piece of legislation, it's a military order, but one of the most progressive things that happens at the end of the Civil War. Now, a couple things here. Again, this is why I wanted to reiterate the attitude of William Tecumseh Sherman. Do not think of him as this egalitarian who believes in racial equality, who wants to provide some sort of recompense for slavery because he believes in that. No, he wanted to deal with a problem, and the problem were the tag-along slaves, and he conquered Georgia, and so he said, there you go. Essentially, you run Georgia now. But the impact on this was amazing. It's essentially this social revolution. But the other thing I want to bring up at this particular moment in 1865 is, how do we create equality? These important legislative changes of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which haven't passed yet when Sherman is doing this, but will pass at the end of the Civil War, that's going to be legal equality for the African Americans. But really, when you get right down to it, the best way to create equality is going to be land reform. In other words, you can't really achieve, and I'm going to speak pragmatically here, you can't really achieve equality unless you have money. And with property is money. You have your own land, you can build a home on it, you can farm it. This was literally revolutionary land redistribution. Let me say that again. This was literally revolutionary land redistribution. Sorry as I trip over my words there. This did an immense amount to create equality for African Americans. William Tecumseh Sherman, Special Field Order number 15, 40 acres and a mule. Now there is a specific story that's really an amazing story that happens in 1865 as a result of Special Field Order number 15. And it happens on the coast of Georgia. So as you see here on this particular slide, if you're looking at it, William Tecumseh Sherman marched from Atlanta to Savannah. You might be familiar with Savannah as a coastal city. It's a city in Georgia, but it's right across the river, the Savannah River from South Carolina. And then just a little bit south of Savannah, there is an island. There's a whole bunch of islands that are down there on coastal Georgia, many of which today are popular vacation destinations. There's actually a very cool United States submarine base that's down there too. You can watch the submarines coming and going from coastal Georgia. But there's an island down there called St. Catharines Island. There's a very old settlement there that dates back to the 1500s. The Spanish actually settled St. Catharines Island in the 1500s. But St. Catharines Island was an old plantation island. There were a few very wealthy families with slaves that lived on that island. And at the end of the Civil War, they were forced to give it all up. Where those white families fled to, I have no clue, but their slaves were freed and they essentially ran the island. So here, if you're looking at your screen right now, is a pretty cool aerial shot of St. Catharines Island today. You can see the old Spanish fort there at the tip of it. And it was here in St. Catharines Island in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, that we see the rise of this particular man. Much like Marshall Twitchell, his was one of the most incredible stories of Reconstruction during the Reconstruction Era. His name was Tunis Campbell. He was not a freedman. He was not a man born into slavery. He was African American. He was born in New Jersey. He was educated in Long Island, New York. And he really is a fantastic example of mid-19th century Black empowerment. He left the North to go south in 1865, not as part of the Freedmen's Bureau like Marshall Twitchell, but independently, not wanting to be associated with the United States federal government, But independently on his own, he wanted to organize and educate and empower freed slaves, African Americans. And he chooses as his base St. Catharines Island. An island is geographically significant because by definition it's cut off from the rest of the land. And he wants to create this community where it's going to be all black. Whites are not going to be allowed on this island. And he can begin the process of creating a society where African Americans feel free, safe, and empowered. So Tunis Campbell looks at St. Catharines Island as a place to create a revolutionary new society in the middle of the 19th century. So he creates a society. It's going to be all former slaves that live there. He creates a form of government based upon the United States government with three branches. There's going to be a court, there's going to be a legislature, and then there's going to be a governor. He is going to be the governor. And he also is going to create an army, a 500-man militia to guard St. Catharines Island. He creates schools. He accentuates the importance of being educated, of learning how to read and write and do mathematics. Just like with the Freedmen's Bureau, there was a very, very strong sense that education was absolutely necessary for your dignity, for your self-protection, and for your own advancement and empowerment. Here's an image of St. Catharines Island under Tunis Campbell's leadership. I find this image to be very telling. If you take a look at all of the houses that they made, you see that there's the trees that have been cut down and the houses that have been constructed on this old plantation land, and the houses are all of equal stature. And I think that's a great metaphor for the equality that he was trying to create on that particular island. So we have St. Catharines Island, run by blacks, creating black empowerment. We have 40 acres and a mule. We have land redistribution in the South. And this is all happening in the summer of 1865 at the end of the Civil War. Sure does seem like Abraham Lincoln's dream of a new birth of freedom is coming true. So then we have to ask, gosh, what happened? Well, we can't understand the fate of Special Order Number 15 in St. Catharines Island without first understanding the story of this individual, the president that followed Abraham Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson. When Abraham Lincoln ran for a second term of office in the year 1864, he chose for his running mate a new running mate and a very interesting man. That individual was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a very interesting choice for a running mate because Andrew Johnson was not a Republican like Lincoln, and he was also not from the North like Lincoln. He was a Southern Democrat from the state of Tennessee. For Lincoln, he was the perfect man for the job because in 1865, when Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated for the second time, the Civil War is coming to a close, and Abraham Lincoln knows he's going to have to deal with Reconstruction. He's going to have to bring the country, North and South, back together in the most harmonious way possible. And in order to better do that, he thinks to himself, well, wouldn't it be great if I had a vice president who was from the South and who was also a Democrat? Because the Confederacy was largely Democratic. I think I could say it was entirely Democratic, actually. And so having Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee, be his vice president, that would enable Abraham Lincoln to do that job a little bit more genuinely. Okay, so that makes sense, but let's try to understand Andrew Johnson here for a second. Here's a Southern Democrat from the state of Tennessee. Why is he not with the Confederacy? When Tennessee, along with the rest of the South, breaks off to secede from the Union to create their own country, why isn't he down there with them? Why is he up in Washington, D.C., remaining in D.C., supporting the Union? Why doesn't Andrew Johnson believe in secession? So in order to understand that, we need to go into Andrew Johnson's background. Andrew Johnson, very similar to Abraham Lincoln, grew up extraordinarily poor in Tennessee. As he grew up, he got a job first as a clothes maker. He was a haberdasher. He was illiterate. It wasn't until he got married that he started to learn how to read and write, and it was actually his wife who taught him how to read and write. Now here's where we get into Johnson's politics. Growing up poor, He had a disdain for wealthy people. And in Tennessee, those wealthy people are the large plantation owners who own slaves. Andrew Johnson gets into politics representing the common man. When the Civil War begins and secession happens in the year 1861, it is those wealthy plantation owners who are the ones who are calling to secede from the Union, so that they may protect their property, so they may protect their slaves, so that they may continue to be wealthy landowners. So when that happens and the Civil War begins, Andrew Johnson says, I do not support this Southern Confederacy because I do not like the men who are leading the secession. I do not like those wealthy plantation owners. So Andrew Johnson remains faithful to the North. So when 1864 rolls around, Abraham Lincoln selects Andrew Johnson to be the ideal running mate to help him reconstruct the South after the Civil War. Now, there is a humorous story often repeated by history teachers like me about the inauguration in March of 1865. Abraham Lincoln stood up and gave his famous second inaugural address, which I talked about earlier in this lecture. Andrew Johnson stood up to give his inaugural address as vice president. But when he stood up to give his speech, it became clear to everyone who heard him that Andrew Johnson was extraordinarily drunk. He had imbibed a great deal of whiskey earlier that morning. He stumbled over his words, he slurred things. He came off looking like a bumbling, drunkard fool. Lincoln's response to this was, Andrew Johnson will never speak in public again. Now, does this mean that Andrew Johnson was a drunk? Was he an alcoholic? Well, later on, when Andrew Johnson becomes president and he delivers speeches, he does so soberly. And there's some evidence that Andrew Johnson, the morning of the inauguration, was sick and decided to self-medicate by drinking whiskey. He just maybe drank a little too much, or maybe a lot too much. But it is this man, Andrew Johnson, who the following month becomes president of the United States of America after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And his experiences and his beliefs become an important part in the Reconstruction era of American history. Let's take a look at a couple of quotes by Andrew Johnson that give insight to his character. Now you remember, because I've said it several times over, that Abraham Lincoln defined this Civil War in the Gettysburg Address and in the Emancipation Proclamation. The meaning and the goal of the Civil War was to provide equality and freedom to all people, blacks and whites. Now, historians love to speculate on how Abraham Lincoln would have actually behaved and what he would have actually done if it had been him who reconstructed America after the Civil War. It is truly one of the great sad unknowns in American history, one of the great hypotheticals. What type of country would we be now had Abraham Lincoln survived and Andrew Johnson not become the president of the United States of America? Because it's very clear that Andrew Johnson did not share the same attitudes that Lincoln expressed in the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation. And these two quotes here reveal this. Concerning why the North was fighting the South, President Andrew Johnson said this, "Damn the Negroes. I am fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters." This quote reveals Johnson's intention is not to provide equality and freedom to the freed African Americans. He really sees the Civil War as a war of spite. He doesn't like the wealthy plantation owners. He wants to see them go down. Now, what we're going to see with Andrew Johnson in regards to that particular attitude is that he's not going to maintain that attitude throughout the course of the Reconstruction era. In fact, he's going to flip, do a complete 180, and actually befriend all of those old aristocratic plantation owners. Now, how and why that transformation happens to him politically and emotionally, we'll get into that. Here's the second quote from Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson says, "White men alone must manage the South." White men alone must manage the South. plainly racist quote. Clearly a quote that supports white supremacy. Andrew Johnson probably is very similar to most people who grew up poor in the South prior to the Civil War and after the Civil War, actually, as well. Martin Luther King Jr., I will actually talk about this in some speeches that he gives in the 1950s and the 1960s. If you grew up poor and white in the South, life was frustrating because, well, you're poor. It's very frustrating to grow up poor. But the one consolation that was given to you from society was this idea that, hey, you're poor, but you're white, which means you're better than those black people, whether they be slaves prior to the Civil War or poor black people after the Civil War. So growing up poor and white, you're going to struggle a lot, just like any poor person. But you actually might become even more of a racist because you held on to this idea that, well, I'm still better than those black people. Those black people are in some way inferior to me. They are less human than me. And Andrew Johnson really embodied that attitude. He was, many historians argue, the most racist president our country has ever had. And man, what a time to be president during the dawn of the Reconstruction Era. Okay, so that's President Andrew Johnson. Now, as we remember our Constitution, the job of the president is to enforce the laws, but it is Congress who makes the laws. And in the Reconstruction era, there was a proud group in Congress that was called the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans were highly influential in presenting and supporting and passing the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. It is the Radical Republicans who believe that the goal of the Civil War was to end slavery and provide equality to all people. These are individuals that believe in African American equality and freedom and want to pass the legislation to create a more free and equal country. The Radical Republicans, there were three principal figureheads of this group of congressmen. The first, probably, and the most famous was the fiery orator, known for being uncompromising in his principles of fighting for equality, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Next, there was Benjamin Wade of, hey, looky here, our home state of Ohio. And then third, there was Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who is actually famous. You may have heard of this in your 8th grade American history class. Before the Civil War, he was severely physically abused by a Southern congressman who broke into his office with a cane and beat him severely. All right, Thaddeus Stevens, Benjamin Wade, and Charles Sumner, the three radical Republicans who believe in freedom and equality for all people. Hey, Benjamin Wade. Benjamin Wade's from Ohio. Specifically, he's from Ashtabula, Ohio, which is in the top northeastern corner of our state. It was a hotbed of abolitionism before the Civil War happened. There were several organizations in Ashtabula that really fought for the abolition of slavery, and Benjamin Wade, a great representative of that culture. In more recent history, Ashtabula is the hometown of the Ohio State University football team's former football coach, Urban Meyer. All right. Now, given everything I've just said about Andrew Johnson, this next act, which he did fairly early on in his presidency, might seem outrageously bizarre. But let me try to explain it like this. Andrew Johnson sort of has two beliefs. One, that rich white men in the South suck. He doesn't like them. He wants to see them pay. He's just sort of spiteful from whatever experiences he had growing up a poor boy. And then he's also a racist. Now, when he's given this position of extreme power, he's the president of the United States of America, what we find with those two beliefs is that the hatred to the white rich plantation owner that got him to remain faithful to the Union during the Civil War is actually going to fade away really quickly. The racist belief is actually going to increase. He's going to become more of a racist as he's president of the United States. But his hatred of the rich white plantation owner, that subsides. Now, why does it subside? Well, I'm going to give you first an emotional reason why it subsides, and then second, I'm going to give you a political reason. First, the emotional reason. Hey, don't we all want to just be loved by people? Andrew Johnson didn't like these rich white guys because he wasn't one of them, but now he's president of the United States of America and he can be friends with them. And that's exactly what he does. And by befriending them and by supporting them during the Reconstruction era, he gets their political support as well. He's going to make a lot of wealthy white Southerner men very happy, and they will naturally support him politically. So one of the very first things that he does is he overturns William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15. That order had been issued in the spring of 1865. Andrew Johnson is going to overturn it before 1865 ends. Those families that inherited 40 acres and a mule were only able to hold on to their land for approximately 6 months. That's it. Catharines Island, Georgia. Tunis Campbell is the governor. We've got an all-black island. The former white plantation owners who used to live there appeal to President Johnson. We want our land back. You've overturned Special Field Order Number 15. We want our island back. At St. Catharines Island, the legislature responds by passing a law that makes it illegal for whites to live on this island or to be on the island. And if you remember, they have a 500-man militia that goes onto high alert, ready to defend their all-African-American island. Johnson's response to this, to recapture the island and return it to its antebellum owners, was very interesting and creative. During the Civil War, Frederick Douglass had convinced Abraham Lincoln to create all African-American regiments to fight the Confederacy. Give African Americans the chance to fight. Abraham Lincoln did. So Johnson sends one of those all African American units to go and recapture St. Catharines Island. So what Johnson did was create essentially a battle where blacks are going to fight blacks. It sounds like a truly awful day in the history of civil rights in America. What happened was the 500-man militia at St. Catharines Island saw the African-American soldiers coming in and refused to fire upon them. The island was recaptured. The property on the island was given back to its original pre-war or antebellum owners. And the African-American people who lived there now have no place to go. What do you do if you're in this situation? You're a freed slave. You had no property before. Now all the property under Andrew Johnson is going to be handed back to every Confederate who applies to get their old land back. What do you do? Where do you go? By overturning the 40 acres and a mule order, the Special Field Order Number 15, which, by the way, Andrew Johnson has the power to do because he's commander-in-chief of the military. Any order a general makes, the president can support or overturn. He's the commander-in-chief. And by using his executive power to recreate the pre-war South, he forces all of those freed slaves into a situation of homelessness and destitution. If you were one of those African Americans back then, what would you do? How would you survive? How would you take care of your family? Well, think of it like this. These are large plantations. It's an agricultural-based economy. Somebody still has to work the fields. Somebody still has to pick the cotton, cut the sugar cane, grow the whatever they're growing, harvest whatever they're growing. Somebody still has to do that. Now, there's no slavery anymore, but there are jobs that are needed. For many African Americans in this situation, They're going to essentially be placed in a situation where they are going to have to beg for their own jobs back, or at least apply for their own job to come back. Now, they're going to get paid because slavery is illegal. But how much do you think they're going to get paid? And let's not even think about income for a second. Let's just take a moment to embrace the humiliation that these African Americans are feeling at this particular point of time, the incredible disappointment. The Civil War is over. The South lost. The Confederacy lost. There was land redistribution in 1865. It was radical. We could have had a completely new society, but the president overturns all of that, and the Old South is recreated almost within a heartbeat. Let's look at this particular quote right here. It's an actual quote from an African American who lived on St. Catharines Island. He said, "You ask me to forgive the white owners of the land. The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, the man who stripped and flogged my mother and sister, and now I am to live on that man's empty lot, do his work and accept his price? That man I cannot forgive." As 1865 rolls into 1866, we're not even 1 year after the end of this war, and things are already starting to look very grim for anybody who believes in freedom and equality of all American citizens. Special Field Order number 15 is long gone. All confiscated land in the South is going to be returned to its original owners. African Americans, destitute and desperate to survive, apply to have their old jobs back. Now, slavery is illegal, but being a worker on a farm is not. So, sharecropping becomes the trade for most of the liberated slaves. And sharecropping is essentially slavery 2.0. Slavery is illegal, but sharecropping is not. What is sharecropping? The sharecropping system was set up to put African Americans into economic debt to the landowners. So here's how it worked for many African Americans. Imagine you were one of these African Americans who's destitute at the end of 1865 going into 1866. You're trying to survive, you got a family to take care of, you got to get money, So what do? Well, you're going to have to go up to one of these white plantation owners and see if you can get a job working on their land. So let's say you get that job. Okay, this is good. So because you're going to get something, you're going to have some way to take care of your family. You're going to get a parcel of land. On this parcel of land that is given to you, you're going to have to pay rent. So you don't actually own that land, you're renting it. Now, how do you pay your rent? You have no money. Well, the landowner says, well, here we're growing cotton, let's say. Okay, so you have to produce a certain amount of cotton. You have to give this cotton to me at the end of the season, and that is your rent. That's what you're going to give me. Whatever you have left over, you can sell, and that'll be your own income. Okay, so let's say you do this and things get started. And let's say you actually make a little bit of extra income from the cotton that you personally sold. Well, you're going to need to buy things like some food for yourself, maybe clothing for yourself and your family. You're going to have to go out to stores. Well, guess who owns the stores and who fixes the prices in those stores? Well, it's the other wealthy white people who run society. And they can fix the prices. And those might be steep for you. You're, of course, not going to have a surplus of money. And you can understand how maybe your position is very vulnerable. What if the landowner says, you owe me more than what you gave me? And you're like, no, this is not part of the deal. Well, what's your recourse there? You're going to try to sue the landowner? You have no recourse. And many African Americans soon found themselves in debt to these white plantation owners. Sharecropping in various ways placed African Americans into debt. That's the new slavery. It is a very practical thing. If you would like to be free, you need money. You need your own financial independence. And African Americans in the Reconstruction Era increasingly found themselves unable to free themselves from this cycle of poverty that sharecropping created. And this was also a way for white people in the South, or at least the white plantation owners, to maintain their power in the post-Civil War era. So this is not an actual quote, it's a quote that I made up, but I tried to capture the attitude of the white plantation owners, where they would say, well, you are free, you African Americans are free, but so am I. And you are free to leave my land if you want, but if you choose to stay, then you're going to work for the hours and pay that I determine. And with few other options, many African Americans were forced to accept the conditions of the old white plantation owners, the old slave masters. Now, here is an actual quote from a white Southern plantation owner in the post-Civil War era. He says this is very telling. Now there is nothing between me and the Negro but the dollar. So prior to the Civil War, if you were a white plantation owner, you adopted the attitude that, well, African Americans, blacks from Africa, are not as moral, not as smart, not as good as white people. And that's why they're the slaves and we're the white masters, and it's our job to take care of them. I mean, that was a white supremacist attitude. But now in the post-Civil War world, where the 13th Amendment has been passed in 1865 and slavery is illegal, what now grants white supremacy is money. And hence this very telling quote, now there is nothing between me and the Negro but the dollar. And then locally, legislation was passed throughout the South that would keep African Americans in a subservient position. Originally, these were called black codes, but I'm simply going to refer to them as their name, or what they've been called throughout most of American history, which are Jim Crow laws. And these local laws did things like banning freed slaves from all work except for being a field hand, working in the fields, and being a domestic servant. These local laws said that blacks were not allowed to carry guns or any type of weapon. And this sounds a whole lot like slavery, indebted families that were too far into debt could have their children removed as a penalty. Now, what happened to those children? We can only know. We can only guess. I would assume they'd probably literally be sold off as if they were slaves to another plantation. So what you're seeing here is all the dreams of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address just being washed away within a year. 1865 to 1866 was this time of extreme hope. Then when African Americans begin forced into a new state of servitude, go figure, race riots are going to begin. Blacks trying to organize themselves, get guns and other weapons, and try to take back over again. In the year 1866, 2,000 African Americans were killed trying to rebel against this new system of oppression and get back to what had been promised to them in 1865. In 1866, Confederates or Confederate sympathizers were getting elected into office, and it had to have been a very interesting, intense time as they went to take their seats at the House of Representatives and the Chamber of the Senate, and they sat right next to the Northerners that had waged war against them the previous 4 years. The legislation that was proposed and the arguments became very heated, and here come the radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens, along with Wade and Sumner, they know what's going on in the South. They understand the system of sharecropping that's being set up. They cannot believe that 500,000 Americans died only to have the South come back. They begin the process of creating federal legislation that will allow all African Americans to vote and provide equality to all African Americans. These are going to be the 14th and 15th Amendments. This will be their way of combating the new, old system of oppression in the South. Go figure, tension develops between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans. From Andrew Johnson's perspective, these Republicans are destroying our Southern culture. It is my job as President of the United States to protect the old Southern culture. The radical Republicans are like, no way. We, the Union, won the war. Approximately 500,000 men died. You're going to let them die for nothing? You're simply going to recreate the old South? So the President of the United States and this legislative group, they hate each other, but I'm going to focus specifically on just the executive branch right now because there's tension there too, significant tension. Because when Andrew Johnson became president of the United States, he inherited the cabinet of Abraham Lincoln. So let me explain that for a second. When Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States, just like if you become president of the United States, you're going to need help. You're going to need cabinet members to run various organizations that are part of the executive branch. So the president doesn't do everything by himself. For example, he needs a Secretary of State to engage in diplomacy with other countries. He needs a Secretary of Defense, or as they called him back then, a Secretary of War, to help him do his job as Commander-in-Chief. There's a Secretary for Agriculture, there's a Secretary for Commerce, there's a Secretary for the Interior. Now, the number of these secretaries has grown over time because there are many more departments. There was, for example, no Department of Education or Homeland Security back then. Those are more recent developments. But there was a Secretary of War, and that position was held by this man, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War Stanton. And here's the showdown that happened. Andrew Johnson doesn't like the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't think that takes much explanation. He doesn't believe in the empowerment of freed slaves. So he says, I want to dismantle the Freedmen's Bureau. So he tells, his subordinate, a person who works for him, Edwin Stanton, dismantle the Freedmen's Bureau. Edwin Stanton says, no, I'm not going to. All right, so imagine you're Andrew Johnson, you tell somebody who works for you to do something, and they say, no, I'm not going to do it. What are you going to do? Well, of course, you're going to try to fire him because you're out of here then, buddy. I'm going to appoint a new Secretary of War. But Stanton knows that he's very popular, that people respect him. He's been the Secretary of War throughout the Civil War. He disregards the president. He's like, I'm not going to leave. Mr. President, the Secretary of War, Stanton, would never say this, but I'm going to put some words on his mouth. Stanton says effectively to Andrew Johnson, you suck. We don't respect you. We need to run the country, so the cabinet is going to try to run the country despite whatever you tell us to do. Andrew Johnson continues to try to fire other members of the cabinet who don't support him because they were faithful to Lincoln, not to him, and trying to appoint new cabinet members that would have had to have been confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so let me go back to this. So when Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States of America, he had a chance to appoint members of the cabinet. Just like if ever you become president of the United States of America, and boy, I sure hope you do someday, you get to appoint like a Secretary for Homeland Security, a Secretary for the Department of the Interior, a Secretary of Defense. We don't have a Department of War anymore. We call it the Department of Defense. You'd hire a Secretary for the Department of Energy. We have all these departments, okay? And when you appoint these people, you can't just say, hey, I like you, you're working for me. There actually is a congressional approval process, which is in the Constitution. You have to get the Senate to vote, to approve through a majority vote this person to work for you, okay? So originally, when Abraham Lincoln wanted Edwin Stanton to be a Secretary of War, he says, this is the individual that I select. And then the Senate had to review whether or not Stanton would be a good Secretary of War and had to approve him through a majority vote, and then he gets the job. Okay, so that process is important here because now we have a president that few people like who's firing people who most of the North at least respects because they were the cabinet for Lincoln during the Civil War, and replace them with essentially his cronies, guys that are going to be faithful to him and do what he wants to do. The radical Republicans will say, okay, we need to respond to this. We need to respond to this. We need to stop Andrew Johnson from doing this. And so this legislative body passes a piece of legislation. This new law is called the Tenure of Office Act, which says this: if the president wants to fire somebody in his cabinet, he must go through the same process as hiring them. In other words, the Senate must vote in favor of the firing. So the Senate has to agree. Now here's what's interesting about Andrew Johnson. He's no longer the babbling alcoholic fool of Inauguration Day. He looks at this piece of legislation that passes and he says, This piece of legislation is completely unconstitutional. This is a setup. So what he does is he intentionally breaks the law. Edwin Stanton, he tells them, you're fired. Get out of here. Radical Republicans are like, yay, he broke the law. Now we can go through an impeachment trial. For the first time in American history, a president of the United States is going to face an impeachment trial. The idea of impeachment goes all the way back to the founding of our country and the Constitution, the idea that nobody in the United States is a king. Nobody is above the law. Even as President of the United States of America, you must behave within the boundaries of the law, or you lose your job. And possibly, after you lose your job, you can face criminal prosecution. But the criminal prosecution part is not in the Constitution. The Constitution just simply grants Congress the power to impeach or get rid of or fire a president. And this impeachment process will happen in early 1868. Andrew Johnson clearly broke the law. Okay, now what does the Constitution say about when you can impeach a president? The Constitution gives us this rather loose wording for when you can impeach the president. It says that the Congress can remove a president, can impeach a president for high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the phrase, for high crimes and misdemeanors. So what's that mean, high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, let me phrase it how I would phrase it. Congress has the ability to remove the president from office if the president has done something really bad. Now, how do you define really bad? Well, you can't, right? It's open to interpretation, as is high crimes and misdemeanors. So in the 1860s, the president has broken the law. He knows he has broken the law. He intentionally broke the law. And the law that he broke was the recent Tenure of Office Act, which was passed by Congress to set him up to break it, to essentially entrap him into breaking it. Does this constitute high crimes and misdemeanors? All right. So how the process of impeachment works, and we've done this 2 other times in American history after Andrew Johnson. First, the House of Representatives has to present and vote on the articles of impeachment. So the House of Representatives has to, present the case and decide whether or not an impeachable offense has occurred. And then it will go to the Senate. And the Senate will ultimately decide whether the president loses his job or not. So the House of Representatives back in 1868 impeached Andrew Johnson. They said that what he did constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors. It's now going to go to the Senate. By the way, these were open to the public. And in a day and age before giant rock concerts, this was probably the hottest ticket in the United States of America, to go to sit in and watch the President of the United States face impeachment. There was, a lot of anger towards Andrew Johnson, and he also had his supporters too. People went to this like it was a sporting event, and they reported it in the newspapers as if it was a sporting event. Now, I don't think this will surprise too many of you. There is an entertainment quality to politics for sure today, and it really was back then in 1868 as well. All right, so it goes to the Senate. The Senate votes not to impeach President Johnson by 1 vote. He keeps his job. Thaddeus Stevens' response to Johnson not getting impeached by 1 vote was this. He said, and I'm going to loosely paraphrase what Thaddeus Stevens said, "Clearly, the United States of America is being run by Satan," implying that only the devil would stop Andrew Johnson from losing his job. Now, Andrew Johnson was able to remain president, but it's 1868. It's the next election year, so his time is nearly up anyway. Pretty much, if you look at him negatively, the damage is already done. He's restored the old Confederacy for the most part. He's restored the old South. He was successful in doing that. Had he actually been impeached, would it have mattered? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. And also, but what I do know is he was politically impotent from this point on. He had no support. So it almost became a joke. Andrew Johnson vetoed more pieces of legislation than any other president in American history. This was his way of saying, screw you to the Congress. Any piece of legislation they passed, he vetoed, he vetoed, he vetoed. But Congress just said, no problem. They overrode the veto with a two-thirds majority vote. It just lengthened the process of getting legislation passed. And that was it for Andrew Johnson. Hey, this has happened 2 other times in American history, this impeachment process. And 2 more times in very recent history, one of these being during your lifetime and probably within your memory. Actually, I hope within your memory. Well, the second time it happened the second time it happened in American history, the first time after Andrew Johnson. In the late 1990s, early 1999, President Clinton was impeached first by the House of Representatives, but then the Senate voted not to impeach Clinton. Clinton was faced with impeachment charges for lying under oath about a sexual affair. The Senate decided that this lie did not constitute high crimes and misdemeanors. The third time this happened in American history was in early 2020. President Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives. When the case went to the Senate voted to not impeach President Trump. The charges here related to President Trump collaborating with a foreign power, specifically the country of Ukraine, holding back financial aid to that country until that country provided damaging political information about one of his political opponents. The founders of the Constitutional Convention set up the impeachment process to ensure that nobody would ever act like a king. This was a way of stopping abuse of power. As it has played out, the process of impeachment is very complicated, and impeachment has thus far in American history never been successful. But if I can go back to 1868, Andrew Johnson is politically impotent. The radical Republicans are exerting a great amount of influence on Congress. So the time has come to pass legislation. In the year 1868, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution was passed. Now, what's interesting about the 14th Amendment is that, and get this, it says in the 14th Amendment, it gives Congress the power to enforce this legislation. It gives Congress the power to enforce legislation. So here's what Congress does. This is interesting. They do something called congressional reconstruction. They divide up the South into 5 military districts. And these military districts are military districts. The United States Army is going to be dispatched into these 5 military districts to enforce first the 14th Amendment to make sure that all people are equal, and then later on, in 1870, the 15th Amendment, which allows all African American men the right to vote. So with the 14th and 15th Amendments passed, and with federal troops in the South enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments, well, now we've got a new chance to change the culture. Now, this isn't going to change the culture overnight because it doesn't affect property. William Tecumseh Sherman in his Special Field Order number 15, that changed everything really quickly. Because it was a time of war, he conquered land, and he said, okay, freed slaves, there you go, there's some land for you. And you can begin farming it right away. It was property redistribution, it was revolutionary, and that changed things quickly. But now you've got all these Jim Crow laws, or black codes as they were called back then, that have already been put into place. In order to change all those laws, here come these troops from the North. And they have to allow for African Americans to vote for representatives to overturn those laws. That is going to be a lengthy process. But the one thing African Americans in the South have going for them is the fact that the troops, the United States Army, are down there and they're protecting their right to vote starting in 1870. And then it's hopefully those new legislators that'll enforce the 14th Amendment down there. So this is going to be a slow, cumbersome political process. It's Very different from a general just saying, hey, I'm redistributing land. Okay, but let's also look at this from the perspective of the white Southerners. Here's the United States Army. It's like the Civil War. Is Civil War still going on? The North is humiliating us, and we have evidence that this is an attack specifically upon the South, because if you go up north, blacks can't vote in particular places up north. They can't vote in Ohio. They can't vote in Pennsylvania. They can't vote in Illinois. So why, in enforcing the 15th Amendment, are the United States federal troops only here in the South, enforcing it in the South? Clearly, the North is trying to destroy our culture, and the northern states are protecting their own self-interests. And and if I can step back and provide my own personal opinion, maybe they're a little bit right. Maybe the troops should have been here in Ohio too, enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, or really the 14th and 15th Amendment here too. Maybe it should have been more universal. But it was probably a practical concern for the Congress. You only have so many troops. The South is pretty big. And it was the South that tried to secede from the Union. So that's where the troops were placed. It's important to know that throughout this whole era, there were the tensions between whites and blacks in particular in the South had created these awful, awful race riots. 1866, at the beginning of Reconstruction, blacks in New Orleans went to the polls armed with guns and demanded the right to vote. This is before the passage of the 15th Amendment. A race riot erupted, whites and blacks killing each other. Some 238 people were killed. Most of them were blacks. But during the process of congressional reconstruction and the United States military down in the South, Congress was able to do a lot to, quote, bring the South into the 19th century. The 19th century being the modern era back then. There was a sense that the South was backward and lagged behind because of all of its ill treatment towards the slaves, to the African Americans that lived there. So now during the process of congressional reconstruction, in military districts, they bring more schools, more hospitals, and they will eventually protect African Americans in their right to vote. It's important to know that all this costs money. The government gets its money from taxing the people. So if you're a white person in the South and a plantation owner and you're a racist, you don't like the fact that the taxes are going up and your taxes are going to support African Americans. Hopefully it's easy to see that that's going to cause some problems. But African Americans after 1870 have the right to vote. The federal government is there protecting them. The military is there protecting them and a right to vote. So what's this mean? Well, it means that African Americans show up to the polls in significant numbers, and we actually have for the first time African Americans in Congress in Washington, D.C. You are looking at an image of the very first African American congressman in American history. Now, everybody in there was elected to the House of Representatives. One of them was elected to the Senate. And our first black senator is the man who is pictured there on the bottom left. He was Hiram Revels of Mississippi. Now, for the former Confederate, seeing African Americans in positions of power, potentially major legislative changes happening ahead, how do you stop this from happening? How do you continue to maintain your position of power and privilege? How do you fight back against this congressional reconstruction? How do you fight back against Northern troops in your town? How do you stop African Americans from going to the polls to vote? Well, one way to do it is through terrorism. And perhaps the most famous of all American terrorist organizations was born during the Reconstruction era. They dressed up in all white so that they looked like ghosts, specifically ghosts of Confederate soldiers that died during the Civil War. They were called the Ku Klux Klan. And sadly, this terrorist organization still exists today. The Ku Klux Klan would use violence and intimidation to stop African Americans from going to vote or for exercising their 14th Amendment rights. They would also terrorize whites that supported Reconstruction. Marshal Twitchell, if you remember him, in northwestern Louisiana along the Red River, was shot and lost both of his arms to the Ku Klux Klan. So the Klan terrorized blacks and anybody who they identified as a carpetbagger or a scalawag. The image that you're looking at here, if you're able to look at it, is a notice that the Ku Klux Klan tacked to the door of an African-American family, or the door of a home of an African-American family. And this notice identifies itself as a ghost of a Confederate soldier, and that the ghost demanded that the recipient of the letter not support the Republican Party, the radicals as they called them, and instead that they should vote right with the white people and vote instead for the Democratic Party, which was, of course, the party of the old Confederacy of the Deep South at this point in time in history. It's also at this point in time in history that a cultural movement starts happening throughout the South, and it actually spreads significantly to the North too. It's identified as the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause, as it is called, was simply this. The South was not an evil place. It was a good place where they had a different type of lifestyle than the North. The South was not filled with big cities, but rather large plantation and plantation homes that were run by good, Christian, moral people. The white plantation owners were good to their white workers and to their slaves. This is the beautiful old South, rocking chairs and sweet tea. This is the deep South of shrimp and grits. And it was an image that was cultivated. Their idea was that the Civil War was not about slavery, but rather simply about states' rights, and that the war was one of northern aggression. The northern states were simply trying to acquire more political and economic power through the Civil War, and that it had nothing to do with slavery, that was something made up by Abraham Lincoln, and that in most cases, the plantation owners before the Civil War were these good, decent people who treated their slaves compassionately and kindly. Now, they were still racist. This was still a racist idea, but the racism was Africans, African Americans, people of African descent, blacks, they are more immoral, they're less intelligent, and they need white people to guide them, to teach them how to behave properly. And that is how slavery was justified. So this image of the lost cause, that the Old South was this beautiful, harmonious place and the Civil War just destroyed all that, that was a piece of propaganda that was cultivated throughout the Reconstruction era. And there are several examples of this propaganda being cultivated at this time and into the 20th century. Part of this image is celebrating Confederate generals during the Civil War. So this is Stone Mountain, Georgia, where you see this huge carved relief of 3 Confederate generals. The 3 men that are pictured on there are General Robert E. Lee, General Stonewall Jackson, and then actually the President of the Confederacy, President Davis. 3 men who had attempted to defend the South from Northern aggression. Into the 20th century, one of the most famous examples of the Lost Cause was one of the very first action-adventure motion pictures. This is an early film from the silent era, 1915. The Birth of a Nation celebrates the heroism of the Ku Klux Klan and how they were valiantly attempting to defend Southern culture from the evil, brutal ways of African Americans. The Birth of a Nation is a highly controversial film because of its subject matter, celebrating the Ku Klux Klan. But in terms of a piece of cinema, it is still studied today. If you ever study film in college, you most likely will watch this film because in terms of an action-adventure film, it sets up the formula for which many action-adventure films have followed since. Okay, but let's now return to our federal Reconstruction let us return to our federal Reconstruction efforts. 1968 was an election year. We had on the Republican side Probably one of the most perfect people who could run for president in the year 1968. The war hero for the North, General Ulysses S. Grant, decides to throw his hat in the ring to become the President of the United States. Now here's a man who led men into battle, who got Robert E. Lee to surrender to him. This is the guy, along with his buddy William Tecumseh Sherman, who really won the war for the United States of America. This is a man who appreciates the massive amount of suffering that happened during the Civil War. If there is anybody in the United States of America who wants to make sure that this war was not fought for nothing, it's President Grant. So, after the whole debacle with the Johnson impeachment, here comes Ulysses S. Grant. Runs for president on the Republican ticket in 1868. His campaign motto, "Let us have peace." That nice, simple, vague campaign mottos, as all campaign mottos tend to be, nothing very specific, but something very positive, does kind of hit at the heart of how Americans were feeling at this time. They were very exhausted from the Civil War. They're exhausted from the troubles of Reconstruction. Grant wants Americans to have peace and to feel comfortable in their lives. And Americans tend to be like this after major wars or other conflicts. They just want a period of normalcy to set in. And Grant does genuinely want to bring this normalcy, this sort of return to things just being okay, back to the United States of America. Now, part of this is going to be fulfilling the goals of Abraham Lincoln. Grant really wants to do that. But Grant's other plan is to provide economic prosperity to the Americans. So Grant sees the way out of all of these troubles with more and more people getting money, more and more people getting rich. So if you have money in your pocket, then you're going to be like, okay, who cares about Reconstruction? I'm happy. I've got money. I can buy things. And so Grant really, those are really the two things Grant wants to focus on during his administrations, and you'll have two of them in American history, is he wants to, fulfill the goals of Reconstruction, and then, make sure people have money. Now, part of this making money will be continuing Western expansionism. And we'll learn even more about this in the next unit. After Americans, were fighting each other, they spread westward. All right. Now, Grant runs for the Republican nomination in 1968. On the other side, the Democrats, their candidate was Horatio Seymour. And Seymour's campaign was not one based upon "let us have peace," but rather racism. In the year 1868, the Democratic Party ran the most openly racist campaign in American history. Look at this campaign flyer. It says, "Our motto, this is a white man's country. Let white men rule." Thus implying the Civil War, the Reconstruction efforts, the freeing of African Americans. This is bringing some sort of evil barbarism into the United States of America. This is a campaign that's clearly advocating for white supremacy, and the Democrats are trying to tap into that racist sentiment around our country, both in the South and in the North, in the year 1868. Here's another very racist piece of campaign material handed out by the Democrats. You have this image that says "the two platforms." And on the left, you have the Democratic platform, and on the right, you have the Republican platform. And on the left, you have a respectable-looking white man with a pretty standard long beard that they had back in the 19th century. And beneath him, it says, "The Democratic platform is for the white man." And on the right side, you have this horrible racist image of an African American with grossly exaggerated features. And it says the Republican platform is for the Negro. Clearly in 1868, to say it again, the Democratic Party is trying to tap into the racism of Americans. Vote for us, have white people run the government, put African Americans back into their place, and then we will have a more civilized country. So in the Seymour-Grant showdown, Ulysses S. Grant wins the presidency, takes the oath of office in March 1869. The radical Republicans really like him. They celebrate him. They're happy he is there. He's certainly going to be better than Andrew Johnson. They did try to control him and try to push him into, passing or to supporting more legislation than he was willing to. And right away, it becomes clear that Grant is going to support the Reconstruction efforts. For example, in the state legislature of Georgia, there were black representatives that had been voted into power. There were black representatives, and the white governor of Georgia was trying to force those black representatives to not even enter the state capitol, to not let them be part of the government. And Ulysses S. Grant forced the governor of Georgia to admit those black representatives. When the KKK was terrorizing blacks and other black supporters in South Carolina, Grant placed 10 counties in South Carolina under martial law. Clearly, Grant is against the KKK and the terrorism they are exerting in the South. Grant is pro-Reconstruction. Grant is anti-KKK. Now here, if you're looking at your screen, are two images of Chicago and New York City in the 1870s. They're interesting photographs to look at. Obviously, there are no cars yet. Those won't be around to the early 20th century. You've got horses and you've got trolleys. But as you look at these images, think to yourself, how are they very different from the images you'd see of Chicago and New York today? And probably the first thing you think of is, well, aside from the streets not being paved and there being horses and trolleys instead of cars, the buildings are very short compared to what you'd see in Chicago and New York today with huge skyscrapers. The buildings there are 6 stories tall maximum. Why only 6 stories tall? Well, this becomes important to the American story, as we'll study in later units. The buildings back then were made out of wood and brick. That's really the only materials that they had to make buildings out of. You can only stack wood and brick up so high before it collapses in on itself. So you can't go higher than 6 stories, otherwise the building becomes unstable, could collapse. In order to build those skyscrapers, you need a different type of material. Do you know what type of material that would be? Do you know how that type of material is made? Do we have that type of material at this point in time in history? And if we do, can we mass produce it? Now, I bring these things up now because all of this relates to American economic development in the late 19th century. This economic development is just starting to pick up in the 1860s, 1870s after the Civil War, and Grant is very much for this economic development. Now, let me reiterate, Grant is a Republican. Part of his agenda to move America forward is to continue to reconstruct the South. And in that, his record throughout his 8 years of being president is pretty clear. He is very anti-KKK. We'll see more of this later. He is very pro-Reconstruction. But along with that, to get America moving forward, and I guess I could say moving westward, is to foster economic development. That means supporting big businesses. And the big businesses of the 1860s and 1870s are railroads. Now, if I can sort of take a moment here to talk about the future of American politics and how it relates to the Grant administration, okay, here are the two things that Grant focused on, Reconstruction and economic development. Reconstruction is going to end in 1877. That will ultimately be a Republican failure. And at that point in time, the Republicans just kind of brush their hands of Reconstruction, say, that's it, we tried, it's over. But that focus on economic development will become, and still remains today, a very central, important issue in any Republican presidential platform. For many Republicans today, the focus of their political platform is economic growth. And if you know your American history, you can say, well, this goes back to President Grant, who really focused on economic growth as a way of moving out of the Civil War era. All right, and how about those railroads? That was the big business of the day. So let's learn about this railroad, arguably the most famous railroad in American history and potentially even world history, the Transcontinental Railroad. In the year 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed into act the Pacific Railroads Act, which allowed for the construction of a transcontinental railroad. Two railroad companies received commissions to build their railroad lines. One, the Union Pacific, would be built from east to west, starting in Omaha, Nebraska. The other, the Central Pacific Railroad, would start in Sacramento, California, and go from west to east. The two railroad lines would eventually link up in Promontory Point, Utah. There's a museum and a national park there today. Each railroad company would receive money based upon each mile of railroad that it laid down. Sometimes the railroads would curve and wind the railroad around so that they could acquire more mileage and get more money. There was a lot of corruption and bribery in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. But this is considered to be one of the most monumental feats in American history. It will be completed in the year 1869, just over 150 years ago. It's been compared to the 1969 United States landing on the moon. It was that big of a deal. It was a monumental engineering feat. Consider the fastest anybody could travel across this amount of land prior to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was 6 months over land, and even that was fast. It took Lewis and Clark over 2 years to traverse this land by foot. If you wanted to travel to New York to California by ship, that is going to go over 18,000 miles. That will take a long period of time, possibly years. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad is considered to be one of the greatest engineering feats in all of history. Consider that if you are traveling from east to west and you're building the Union Pacific Railroad, that is honestly the easier job. You're going across the plains. However, if you're starting in Sacramento and traveling eastward and you're building the Central Pacific Railroad, that is much more difficult because pretty much as soon as you leave Sacramento, heading east, you hit these guys. These are the Sierra Nevada mountains. They're huge. Some of them are as high as 2 miles high. How do you build a railroad over that? The engineer who designed the railroad and how it would pass through the Sierra Nevada was a man by the name of Theodore Judah. He was known as Crazy Judah. He designed these elaborate bridges and trestles, identified places where mountains could be tunneled through, and by all accounts, Crazy Judah reveled in the challenge of his job. Among the greatest stories of the Transcontinental Railroad are not the politicians and the companies behind it, but rather the individuals who built it. For both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, there was a polyglot workforce. On the eastern side, where the Union Pacific was being laid down, you had Civil War veterans, both from the North and the South, laying down track together. You also had a significant number of Irish immigrants who were laying down this track. Now, famously, on the other side, on the western side, on the Central Pacific side, you had a significant number of Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants play a very significant role in the history of 19th century California and the United States of America as a whole. At the exact same time that the United States was fighting its Civil War, there was a even more terrible civil war with an astronomically high death toll that was going on in China. That civil war was called the Taiping Rebellion. Some individuals from China fled that Taiping Rebellion, coming to San Francisco, in part to escape the violence, and also because starting in 1849, there was the gold rush in San Francisco, and these Chinese immigrants, like all immigrants that come to the United States of America, were inspired by the possibility of a better life. And when the Transcontinental Railroad started being built, and there were all of these job opportunities for men who were willing to work extraordinarily grueling hours and do very difficult tasks, then even more men came over from China to participate in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And because they were part of the Central Pacific Line, they were assigned to do some of the most difficult work at some of the lowest wages. It was mostly Chinese immigrant labor that built structures like this. this trestle through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then when it came to digging a tunnel through the mountains, these workers had to chip away at granite. The largest tunnel that they had to dig was 1,649 feet in length. You can only imagine how painfully slow it would be to dig such a big tunnel at such a length when you can only chip away literally inches a day. So the railroad companies decided to use nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin, which is a highly volatile substance, which is 13 times more powerful than gunpowder. It could not be made in a lab and then shipped to the site to be used. It had to be made on site because it was so volatile. One of the chemists who was making the nitroglycerin on the Central Pacific line was so nervous because really just working with this substance could potentially blow you up. He took to drinking, became an alcoholic, but he taught some of the Chinese laborers how to make this substance. They made the substance, they didn't receive any additional pay like the chemist did, and they used it to blow through the mountains. Approximately 1,500 Chinese immigrants will die using nitroglycerin to blow holes through mountains in order to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. On May 10th, 1869, the Union Pacific Railroad line and the Central Pacific Railroad line connected in northern Utah in a place called Promontory Point. A celebratory photograph was taken of individuals, important men from both sides who were responsible for the construction of this railroad line. If you're able to look at this screen right now, you will see that there are no Chinese Americans present in this photograph. Why not? Well, mostly because Chinese people were looked down upon for cultural reasons by white people. And of course, it was all white men that ran the railroad companies and were politicians at this point in time in history. The famous Golden Spike was hammered into place, connecting the two railroad lines by this man, Leland Stanford, former governor of California, a man largely responsible for the 1849 gold rush, a discoverer of gold himself, and yes, the Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, outside of San Francisco, is named after Leland Stanford. Railroads were being laid down all over the United States of America, connecting towns. With the Transcontinental Railroad, a 6-month wagon ride across the country now is reduced to 6 days. The country is getting smaller, people are coming together, there's more opportunity to make and ship goods, and the railroad companies can charge for shipping. Guys, railroads were the Amazon.com of their day. It was constantly expanding. There was a lot of money to be made. A lot of people were investing in railroads. And with all this money coming into a mostly unregulated industry, yes, there was a lot of bribery, there was a lot of embezzlement. And this will lead to an economic disaster 4 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed 1 year into the Grant presidency, and he naturally celebrated this. This is the United States of America coming together. It was sort of a great symbolic thing that you had both Union veterans and Confederate veterans side by side laying the Union Pacific line, working collectively to develop the country, to spread westward, to bring greater economic prosperity. This was good. Grant wanted the country to have peace, and we're seeing, at least for a time, some economic development. At the same time, Ulysses S. Grant is doing absolutely everything in his power to put down the KKK in the South. He's a revered war hero, so he could have been arguably one of the greatest presidents in American history. He seems to be doing good things. Now, President Grant wasn't very charismatic. He wasn't a great public speaker or anything like that. He also struggled his entire life with alcoholism. He was an alcoholic. But in terms of what he's doing for the country, it seems to be largely positive and progressive. However, from the late 19th century to the early 21st century, President Grant has been considered by historians, by many historians, to be one of the worst presidents in history. Why is that? Well, because he was surrounded by corruption. Individuals that he was close with, individuals in his cabinet, people who had been appointed to government jobs by Ulysses S. Grant were discovered to be corrupt. His Secretary of War was busted for accepting bribes. Some federal tax collectors in St. Louis, who were directly appointed by Grant, were found stealing money from the federal treasury. His own personal secretary was accepting bribes from the Democratic Party in exchange for giving the Democratic Party some of Grant's personal political notes. And there's all this corruption that's surrounding President Grant. And when this gets reported, especially the people who he appoints who are accepting bribes or are stealing the public's money, a lot of people start to suspect, well, what type of company is Grant keeping? Whether you like it or not, you tend to be defined by the friends that you keep. And if your friends are corrupt, most people are going to assume that you are corrupt as well. Now, there is not much historical evidence that would support that Grant in any way stole or accepted bribes or profited or in any way because of his presidency. In fact, it's kind of sad. Grant was somewhat naive about the friends that he was keeping, and in the end, much of his personal money was stolen. At the end of his life, after serving 8 years as President of the United States of America, President Grant, who was a cigar smoker, was dying of cancer. He was really sad because his wife Julia and his children were all going to outlive him, and he had no money to bequeath to them upon his death. He literally was dying in poverty. By the way, for what it's worth, Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Grant, one of the great love stories from American history. This man was 100% faithful to his wife. And that alcoholism I talked about earlier, Grant rarely drank to excess when Julia was around. It was only when she was gone. And sadly, when he was a soldier in the Civil War, she was gone a lot. U.S. Grant and his wife Julia loved each other very much. Always nice to hear of a good love story. Okay, but back to his presidency, most historians have previously had a very negative view of Grant. They say he was a great general, he won the war for the North. But then, some historians say he was too lenient on General Lee and the Confederacy when they finally surrendered in 1865. And then his administration was one of the most corrupt administrations in American history. Or at least a corrupt administration in American history. We've had several corrupt administrations. And therefore Grant was a bad president. Just a few years ago, the historian and biographer Ron Chernow wrote a very large book and a biography on U.S. Grant. Some of you may be familiar with Ron Chernow. He is the one who wrote the biography on Alexander Hamilton, after which Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical is based off of. A lot of you guys have heard of Hamilton the musical. Chernow's the guy who wrote the biography that it was based on. So after he wrote Hamilton, he wrote Grant. And in this book, Chernow tries to explain the psychology of Ulysses S. Grant. Here's what he says. This is my brief summary of it. Grant grew up a very poor boy in southern Ohio. It was this poverty of his youth that inspired some of his bad decisions as an adult, according to Chernow. Growing up without any type of economic security, Grant spent the rest of his life fearful that he was once again going to land in poverty. He never felt economically safe. And it was because of that anxiety that he had that he took comfort in finding friends who were rich. He enjoyed the company of the wealthy and the prosperous because in their company, he felt some sort of security, some sort of safety. And so he probably let go of his better judgment and trusted these people far more than he ever should have. And coincidentally, it was a wealthy person who ended up earning the trust of U.S. Grant, and Grant gave him this money for investment, for his security, for financial security, and this guy ended up stealing U.S. Grant's money. So it was actually this fear of being poor that U.S. Grant decided, okay, I'm going to be friends with these rich people and trust them because they're financially stable. And it was that move which actually ended up impoverishing him again at the end of his life. So I'm not doing justice to the entire book, but this is essentially one of the things that Chernow explains in terms of the psychology of President Grant. Now back to what people thought about him at the time. People didn't trust U.S. Grant because he was surrounded by corrupt people who were constantly getting busted, and essentially people just thought that Grant must also be corrupt himself. All right. Now, one thing that certainly was corrupt at this period of time in history were the railroad barons and the railroad industry. But many people at the time were investing money into the railroads because it seemed to be a safe bet. So many railroads were being laid down. Many people thought, well, I'm going to invest my money into these railroads because certainly they're going to become profitable and they're going to pay out. This was railroad speculation. The thing is, not all of those railroads paid out. In the year 1873, there was a stock market crash. At the time, it was called a panic. This was the Panic of 1873. It was also called the Great Depression of 1873, but please do not confuse this with the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, there are various economic causes for the Panic of 1873. Some of them relate to financial things that were going on that related to war and the economy in Europe. I'm not even going to be able to get into this because I admit I can't explain all the causes of the Panic of 1873, but here's what you need to know. In the panic, in the year 1873, the stock market crashes. 1 million people lose their jobs. There's unemployment, there's homelessness, there's now poverty, there's hunger. We have a major depression. If this is the economic situation in the year 1873, no longer does anybody care about the Reconstruction of the South, or at least fewer and fewer people do. Let's say you're living in Columbus, Ohio in the year 1873. You got a job and a family, but then you lose your job as a consequence of this panic. Can't afford to pay rent. How are you going to feed your family? You might find you and your family on the street, trying to find friends to live with, trying to find a job. Even if you cared about the Reconstruction of the South, even if you were one of these people who said, I believe in the freedom and the equality of all people, including freed slaves in the South, I want to see Reconstruction happen in the South. Well, how much are you going to care about that when you can't even feed your own children? On top of that, in the year 1873, the popular press begins reporting about how black politicians are accepting bribes in the South Carolina legislature. So these African Americans are corrupt. Now, likely, many politicians accept bribes, especially at this point in time in history. But the press is focusing on African American politicians accepting bribes, painting racist caricatures of them, like you see in this particular image, and playing into this narrative that African Americans are more immoral than white Americans and less civilized than white Americans. And with them in charge, or at least playing a role in government, the whole system is starting to become unraveled. More and more people across the United States of America, North as well as South, begin embracing this image of the lost cause. That the South wasn't that bad before the Civil War. That slaves were happy, singing songs in the field. And amid the chaos and confusion of the Reconstruction era, maybe we should go back to that. In the year 1874, the KKK laid siege to the Republican Convention in New Orleans. Remember that the Democratic Party drew lots of its support from the old Confederates of the South, whereas the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln in the North. The KKK were attacking people who were going to the Republican Convention. U.S. Grant responded to this by taking United States federal troops, the U.S. Army, sends them down to New Orleans to protect it, to protect the state legislature, to protect the courthouses, and to keep the peace. Now, Grant was a Republican, and the fact that he sent federal troops to New Orleans to protect the Republican convention, some people say, or some people said back then rather, that this is an abuse of power. This president is a Republican president and he's using federal troops to protect the Republican convention in New Orleans. He's only protecting his own party. And would he really have done this if this was a Democratic convention? But for U.S. Grant, Grant simply sees the KKK as a white supremacist terrorist organization that shouldn't be allowed to threaten anybody. And Grant has dispatched federal troops throughout the South during his 2-year administration. Or I'm sorry, his 8-year, his two-term administration. But as we get to the end of those 2 terms in 1876, Grant has lost a lot of support. There's an economic depression that's going on. There is high levels of unemployment. There's a sense that the president might be abusing his power to support his own political party. Grant's 2 terms are done, and we're going into an election year in November of 76, with people losing faith in the Reconstruction effort and tired of it, especially during a economic depression. The stage may be set for a Democratic president. Before that happens, there was one incredible piece of legislation that was passed by the federal government. It was introduced by this congressional representative from Mississippi. He's a black man. His name was John Roy Lynch, and he proposed a civil rights bill in 1875 that made it illegal to segregate or discriminate based upon race in any public institutions or in any public space. In other words, everywhere across the United States of America, blacks were allowed to have access to anything whites had access to. This Civil Rights Bill of 1875 passed. However, it was never enforced. 10 years later, it was ruled unconstitutional. Just like with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, had this Civil Rights Bill been enforced and remained, we'd be living in a very different United States, guys. One in which there would be a lot more racial equality. But this is it. We're reaching the end of the Reconstruction era. It was an era of amazing promise and amazing gains for African Americans. It was an amazing moment of civil rights development. You had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. You had the freedom to vote no matter who you were, as a man at least at this point in time in history. Didn't matter the color of your skin. You have a definition of citizenship given to us by the 14th Amendment and equality under the law. To enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment, Congress dispatched the military to the South. Grant tried to put down the KKK by military force. Once again, the purpose of Reconstruction was to fulfill the promise of Abraham Lincoln that this Civil War that ended in 1865 would be the new birth of freedom, that we would have a country based upon freedom and equality for all citizens, black and white. And all of these legislative reforms and the enforcement of that legislation in the South was working. Gains were being made. We have black representation in local, state, and federal governance. Laws like the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 are being passed. There is the promise of equality. But then it all ends. How does it end? Here's how. The Reconstruction era ends with the election of 1876. The 2 candidates for president were, for the Republicans, Rutherford B. Hayes of Delaware, Ohio. He's a Republican. If the Republicans win, the Reconstruction efforts continue. Representing the Democrats is a new and different type of Democrat. He's not as much of a racist. He's from New York. His name is Samuel Tilden. Now, when you get to 1876, the Democratic Party is starting to change. The Democratic Party, all the way through the 1860s, found its base in the old Confederacy. The Democratic Party wanted to get more votes and more power by reaching out to a new constituency. And that new constituency was the people that are coming in from Europe, immigrants. After the Civil War and after the massive loss of life during the Civil War, almost all of which were the loss of men, we need more men to work in the United States of America, especially as we spread westward. So this is when we open our doors to immigration, and we have a mass influx of immigration. And of course, the immigrants come into major metropolitan areas. Think New York City, Boston, Chicago. And it was the Democratic Party, far more than the Republican Party, that looked at these immigrants that were coming in and said, we want to support you. So it was the Democratic Party that reached out to these immigrants almost immediately after they got off the boat in the United States of America, helping them to find jobs and housing in support for their vote. And this method largely worked, which is why if you go to major metropolitan areas today, like Chicago, Boston, New York City, you'll find that even still today, these are Democratic strongholds for the Democratic Party. And that goes back to this Reconstruction era. All right, so the first Tuesday in November, 1876, we have ourselves an election. Hands down, Tilden wins the popular vote. So, does Samuel Tilden of New York become the next president of the United States? No, it doesn't work like that. According to the Constitution, each state has a group of representatives that represents that state in the Electoral College. It is the winner of the Electoral College, not the popular vote, that becomes the president of the United States of America. It becomes a state issue. And there were 3 states that were too close to call. Those states were, for what it's worth, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. So there were recounts, there were debates, there was a whole lot of hoopla in trying to decide who the next president of the United States was going to be. This started in November of 1876. When you get to March of 1877, there is still no clear winner of the 1876 election. And it's now been going on for over 4 months. And whoever wins this election, it will determine the future of the Reconstruction, of the future of Reconstruction and what happens. So how does this resolve itself? It was resolved only 2 days before the inauguration was scheduled to take place. Instead of letting the courts or the states decide, the leaders of the Democratic Party met with the leaders of the Republican Party. They met in Washington, D.C. in a private, secret, backroom deal. And here's the deal that was proffered by the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The Democratic Party leaders told the Republican Party leaders, we will let Rutherford B. Hayes become the next president of the United States of America, even though Samuel Tilden won the popular vote. Rutherford B. Hayes of Delaware, Ohio, this Republican, this Civil War veteran, this very religious man, because he was, will become the next president of the United States of America. You Republicans get the White House. But, as part of this deal, here's what we Democrats want. We want you to end the federal military occupation of the South. The federal troops must leave the South, leaving us in the South to rule ourselves. This will effectively end Reconstruction. This deal is made. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president of the United States of America. What's this mean? Oh, it means we've got a 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Those are federal laws. They'll survive. But guess what? Nobody's there to enforce them. So the Jim Crow laws come around. Jim Crow laws are designed to segregate and oppress African Americans. Jim Crow laws segregate blacks so that they can only live in particular areas. They can only go to particular schools. They will have their own restaurants. They will have their own grocery stores. There will be white parts of town where African Americans are not allowed to live and they're only allowed to go into if they are there working for white people. Jim Crow laws do things like prevent African Americans from carrying a gun, and they also restrict the type of education they can receive and the types of jobs that you can have. It is worth noting that the Jim Crow laws are completely illegal under the 14th Amendment, but guess what? A law doesn't matter if there's nobody there to enforce it. Nobody was there to enforce the 14th Amendment. And so the Jim Crow laws and this culture of racism, segregation, and oppression was perpetuated. How long did Jim Crow laws last? They lasted until the year 1964. We have an additional 100 years after the end of the Civil War of Black oppression. As I've said before, and as I encourage you to remember, the North won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction. So much of the current problem between races today stems back from this 1876 election and that backroom deal that happened in early March of 1877. This is not an event that happened a long, long time ago. This is an event that lives with us still today. If you're Black and you're living in the South after 1877, the situation is dire. How are you going to survive? Well, one of the things that many African Americans resorted to as a way to protect their culture was religion. African American churches in the South, like this one, became your refuge from the world and your place for freedom and happiness. Now, the Black church goes back a long way. When slaves were originally forcefully imported from Africa, they were forced to become Christian by the plantation masters in the South, because for them, Christianity was the right religion, the good religion, it's the religion they believed in, and Christianity could be used as a method to control slaves. But a lot of that traditional African culture was maintained in the African American churches. So in other words, even though they were Christian churches, a lot of traditional African lifestyles and music and song and dance became integrated with the African church, with the African American churches in the South. This then is perpetuated from the Reconstruction era all the way really through present day. African American church services tended to be extraordinarily lively. Ministers didn't just read monotonously through the Bible or from the Bible. It was really performance art and great oration to inspire the congregation that they engaged in. And the Black churches in the South became the center of the community. It became the center of your social life. It was a place where you were excited to go. And it was truly a refuge from the cruel reality of oppression that existed throughout the rest of the South. So in order to accentuate the significance of the African American churches, let me jump ahead in history significantly to the 1940s. I want to introduce you to this man right here if you're looking at your screen. There's a picture on the left and on the right, but the right is a book cover. That individual, that picture was probably taken in the 1960s. That man's name was Thelonious Sphere Monk. Thelonious Monk was one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. He was prominent in the late 1940s and the 50s and the 1960s. He was sort of known publicly for his eccentric dress, which you sort of get a sense of here. In my own personal opinion, one of the greatest pianists our country has ever produced, Thelonious Monk. I mean, he was just a perfect piano player. Like, he never hit the wrong note. And he was so creative in how he played. But Thelonious Monk, when he started off in his first band in the 1940s, and he was a teenager when he joined his first jazz band, he started off in the North, but they traveled throughout the South performing. Now, he's in an all-Black jazz band in the late 1940s, and the Jim Crow laws are still very much in effect. So if you're traveling in a jazz band, where do you think you're going to stay as you travel? You think you're just going to pull up to a local hotel or a motel and say, hey, we'd like a room for the night? No, that's not happening. So where do you go? Well, you go to the churches. The image on the right there is a book cover from the American historian Robin Kelly. He wrote this big biography on Thelonious Monk, and it's pretty much considered, as of today, the best biography on Thelonious Monk ever written. Robin Kelley is a very rigorous historian who did a lot of research and drew upon a lot of facts to shed a more accurate historical light onto this rather enigmatic jazz musician from history. And Robin Kelley talks about how, as a teenager in this band, Thelonious Monk's band would have to go to the black churches, have to locate the black churches, and it would be the black churches that would find families for them to stay with as they traveled throughout the South, which was in and of itself dangerous, to perform and to make money. And as I read that in Robin Kelley's biography of Monk, I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. After the Reconstruction era, man, those black churches were really the safe haven for African Americans. Now, even a few decades even after, Thelonious Monk in the 40s, actually one decade after Thelonious Monk in the 40s, when you have the emergence of the civil rights movement under the leadership of men like Martin Luther King Jr., that civil rights movement is founded in black Christian churches in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. himself is a minister, once again revealing the importance and the significance of black Christian churches in the South. As you remember, we don't have slavery anymore, but we do have sharecropping. Sharecropping lasts a long time. It lasts well into the 20th century. It's not going to be until the 1950s that a massive civil rights movement is going to start up in the wake of World War II, and a lot of historians believe because of World War II, to finally end the injustice of the Compromise of 1877. And as I mentioned before, this continues today. As I record this lecture in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement is in full swing. No matter how you feel personally about the Black Lives Matter movement, as a good student of history, you now can understand the historical context from which it emerged. Had the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution been enforced when they were enacted, we probably wouldn't have any need for the Black Lives Matter movement today. We would most likely be living in a society where there was more freedom, no matter what your race was, and there would be more equality. We are still today dealing with the legacy of slavery and then the lack of the enforcement of the 14th Amendment for nearly 100 years after that 14th Amendment was passed. So once again, I reiterate this statement that I would like for you to know. The North may have won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction, and we're dealing with that legacy. I would like to end on this note, a great quote from a great historian. Her name is Barbara Fields. She was one of the interview subjects for one of the most famous documentaries of all time. That documentary being the 9-hour-long series, The Civil War, made by the documentarian Ken Burns. At the very end of this long documentary, Barbara Fields is talking about the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And here's what she has to say about everything I just described. Barbara Fields said in 1990, "The Civil War is still going on. It's still to be fought, and regrettably, it can still be lost. The failures of Reconstruction still haunt us today. We're still dealing with it today. Who knows what tomorrow holds?" Guys, thank you very much for paying attention to this lecture. Hope you learned something good. Have a wonderful day.